do our thing. All right, so first hour we said we want to do some long tail stuff, and then the second hour we tackle the first one here. So then, is Carlos on the call, or somebody else on the call that can talk to this one here?
Yeah, yes.
Perfect.
So the idea is to suggest, to detect cases where the user using two upper or two lower, and just change it to upper invariant or two lower invariant. There are a couple of cases, let me remember. Well, yeah, the overload that takes the culture is the one that is a bit different. I think I left a few user examples below.
So what is the rationale for this analyzer that we don't like the culture aware two lower, two upper behavior? So we want to tell people not to use the APIs? Is that?
I think the intention is just to have the users intentionally understand that like they have to pass culture while calling two lower, two upper. They assume that it can be ordinal two lower, two upper, which is not true.
So when I call to lower with no arguments, it's culture aware, correct?
Yeah, it will use current culture, yes.
So if the analyzer suggests two upper invariant or two lower invariant, then that seems to suggest the analyzer is pushing people to change the behavior of their code.
Correct.
Yes.
Is that what we actually want, or do we want it to just say pass the culture to be explicit or call invariant if you actually didn't want culture?
Yeah, I think this will be better. I mean, to let the user choose between invariant or current culture or any other culture, but not suggesting invariant by default.
So analyzer but no fixer is what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
I mean, you can have two fixers that run on it to allow someone to take a choice. One would be pass current culture, and the other would be call to lower invariant.
Right.
So I'll ask my standard question. How is that different from obsoleting these APIs?
If you're in a WinForms application or other UI-based application, like you're going to want to call this most of the time. That's the problem, I think. When you're displaying something to the user, when you're intending to operate in that user's native language, you generally want these APIs to be culture aware. That's why string was culture aware to begin with, because it was meant for these, rich GUI scenarios.
Right, but the same, like obsoleting this method and saying either pass an explicit culture or current culture or call the invariant version, like that still works for UI-based apps. If we're saying that we think the problem is no one understands, or that people get confused of whether it's culture aware or not, then what Steve said, we would just mark the member as obsolete. That's the analyzer, and then we can register some fixers for convenience if we want.
But String doesn't have any other API that can do two upper, two lower for any cultures.
Two lower that takes a culture. We would only obsolete the zero argument overload.
Yeah. I mean, my reasoning for not doing that would be there are scenarios where you genuinely don't care, right? So like imagine you're in the debugger, for example. I don't care at all, right? I just want to get the string too lower right now, right? So like I don't want to, like imagine in the debugger you're forced to say too lower and then open parentheses and then culture info dot something and then culture info happens to be not in IntelliSense, and it's like if I'm in the debugger and I'm evaluating something, I couldn't care less about the culture.
The debugger doesn't honor obsolescence or anything like that.
No, but like it's kind of like I guess that's fair. But then I think if you still have the API and you still call the API in certain scenarios, or imagine scripting, right? In scripting it would actually squiggle it, right? But you're also not very likely to care in scripting either, right?
Part of my asking about obsolescence is just like, do we actually need to add an analyzer? Isn't obsolescence the same thing? And part of my asking about it is to play devil's advocate, to say like, well, every time we bring up obsolescence, we talk about all the scenarios where it ends up being relevant. It's fully relevant in Windows Forms. It's fully relevant in Xamarin. It's relevant in WPF. It's relevant in the debugger. So why are we suggesting an analyzer that would run everywhere and tell people not to use it?
I mean, that's an interesting question, right? So one thing we could decide to say, I don't know how much metadata we have, but you could, for example, say based on project type, we only turn it on when you're in a class library context, for example, because, well, most class libraries probably don't know which context they're running in, right? And then in this case, you would say, well, please make a decision which culture you want to use. But if you're in a UI, or if you're in an XE project, we just don't care.
Do we have that ability today to change default warning level based on project type?
That's what I'm saying. I don't know whether we do. I mean, it's all MS built, so presumably you could. But yeah.
Is this need to be a warning? Can be just like the info? I mean, like, because I'm seeing, I mean, the main goal here is if somebody doesn't understand the behavior of the upper two lower while not passing any parameter, they can shoot themselves. And this is the case that we need to help them. Obsoleting, yeah, I mean, like, I wouldn't mind to obsolete it if we need to, yeah. But what I'm hearing that other people is using it and they understand it, so my whole goal is just give some extra info to whoever writing the code like this and telling like maybe you consider the other one or something like this. It doesn't have to be a warning or strong warning.
I mean, I would say, like, coming from the FXCorp experience, this is one of the most hated things in FXCorp, right? Because it's super noisy in terms of how many violations it will typically find. But I think in a particular project context, you are probably likely to be able to make a decision which culture is the correct one. And so that's one of those areas where the fixer would actually help you, because you could basically say, well, I'm in this class library, so, you know, there's a close to 100% chance that current or invariant is the right one, and then you can just say fix all, right? And so if we paired with a fixer, I'm personally probably more okay with that being a warning. But like, I will also say, like, if it's on for every project type, it's going to be super noisy and probably not super helpful. Because the thing is, if you're building a UI app, it really doesn't make a difference, right? And you just force people to write more characters to do the exact same thing they can already do with the fewer characters. So I think unless we can scope it to the project type, I think I would just not bother.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when FXCop had the rule of you need to pass things, it started because there were becoming more server workloads, and it's you probably didn't want the server's culture to be the thing changing these strings. And
right.
So having something like, hey, I see you're a web server project, like, and then it turns the rule on to a higher thing than info or nothing or whatever, makes some sense to me. And then that would be the fact that it's then opt-in or contextual would be why it's not an obsolescence. To Steve's devil's advocate question. But yeah, I think that there are a class of people who would want to say that in a particular project they don't want any of the wait, was this culture aware or not calls, and that they either want it to be explicit or that they really wanted everything to be invariant or really wanted everything to be culture. And sure, making a fixer for them is nice.
All right, so from that perspective, I mean, if we're talking about whether like we could ship an analyzer and fixer for it, sure, you could imagine it defaulting to none, and then people have to opt into it fully. The difference between none or hidden and info, like, I don't have a strong opinion. I do wonder if we seem to be doing this piecemeal, like we previously did this for things that took string comparisons or whatever, and now we're doing it for too low or too upper. do we need a comprehensive review of all the APIs that deal with this kind of stuff and kind of make sure we're warning it for all of them? Or is this the last one?
I don't think this is the last one.
So to your question, Steve, there was a work item tracking, like, should we just have a switch for the entire application, which says all of the by default cultureware APIs are now ordinal or invariant, and if you want the old behaviors, just flip the switch back on.
Well, I wasn't talking about changing the behavior. I was talking about flagging things beyond too low or too upper as maybe you want to call a different method.
Yeah, I guess it would just be a different way of approaching the same problem, so that you don't need to create analyzer after analyzer after analyzer.
I mean, can we have a fixer of no analyzer? Does that work?
You need a diagnostic ID to link it to.
So basically, you would have an analyzer that would basically report info, and then we can have a fixer, and it's basically just not visible by default. Is that how it works?
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
So basically, does that mean, because I mean, in my class libraries, I would actually like if I could just, control dot and convert my to upper to, to upper invariant or something to avoid the typing, right? Or even be able to do a fix all. But like, it seems like in order for me to have that experience, you would have to have an analyzer that at least reports it with a, very low severity, right?
Yeah, I mean, the lowest you could go would be hidden, which basically means you don't see it in the command line. You don't even see it in the suggestions window in Visual Studio. But if you were to hover over it, if you were to click on the line, you'd see the like ... underneath. And if you were to click on that, then you would be able to apply it. And then you can apply it to the hover.
I see. I mean, that one does seem valuable to me, right? Because, I mean, one of the problems that we have with people is that doing the right thing when it takes more characters, people are just not very inclined to do that. So if you can just make doing the right thing more, more easy, I think we're adding value. But I am somewhat hesitant to say, like, we generate a warning in project types where it literally adds zero expressiveness, because all you do is turn people off from the analyzers, right? If you're building a WPF app and it flags too lower, you're like, I don't care, man. Like, it's totally fine here. And so I think unless we can scope it, I would consider the fixer, but not the warning, basically.
But I think talking about this analyzer, but with a severity of hidden.
Yes, that would basically be that, right? I mean, you could also argue that, info may make it more discoverable, that you can at least turn it on if you wanted to in your project type, but I'm not sure people care enough to do that. Yeah. I mean, to Steven's earlier point, it does seem like something we maybe want to have a holistic review on, like how much do we care about the, culture-specific APIs, and how do we want to promote this, right? Because I do think if we could scope it by project type, it might be actually more useful. But then it's probably also not enough to just scope it on is it a DLL project or not, because not all DLL projects are created the same, right? Some things might be user controlled, some things might be test projects, right? In which case you probably also don't want to have it turned on by default. And I don't know whether we have even the right information in MS Build to even identify what kind of thing you're building, really. But it does seem like if we could do that, we may want to consider that.
Yeah, I mean, my best guess would be that somewhere there's basically an include file of, like, server appropriate warnings that a library could include, and that the ASP web types would turn on or would include by default. I don't know if our SDKs do that, but that's the best that I can imagine with the tech that I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it sounds to me like it shouldn't be obsolete because we don't want it super aggressive, and if we do it, it should be hidden by default. But then that means that there's a fixer that'll give you the bulk replacement. So. seems low priority. Okay. Nice up for grabs.
Yeah. So what did we conclude? We basically said like we are okay with this being hidden with fixer, and we may want to look into the project type thing, or are we saying approved, or like I'm confused. What is the actual thing we would approve here?
My understanding of the consensus is we're approving the concept that the default visibility should be hidden, that there should be two fixers, or two suggested fixes rather, one for go to the invariant and another for pass culture info.current culture, just to make all your warnings go away. And then the as a follow-up, nice to have for a PM emo, maybe we should look and see if there's a way that we can get analyzers opted in by default based on project types.
I'll take a plan.
That's what happens when you let me summarize. You get work.
No, I think it's good if somebody else summarizes what they think I said, so then I'm confident that you're okay with what I suggested. Okay, so hopefully you can still see my screen.
Yep.
Alrighty, then let's move on. I think this one was a bigger one, which I think we need a dedicated review for. Yep, I will set one up for next week, so let's skip this one. Tarek, I think this is yours.
Yes. Yeah. So this is regarding logging. So in .NET 5, we have allowed the logging to opt in to produce like logging some tracing context information inside the logging scopes. So the way to opt in, I mean to have this activity tracking options, I mean to add it to the builder, logging builder, and you enable this and you will get this inside the logs. I mean like span ID, trace ID, parent ID, trace state, and trace flag. So the ask here is people need to add some more stuff to opt into more stuff if they need to. This is the tags and the baggage. So basically, the ask here is just to add this extra two values and handle this in the scope. If somebody opted in for this tags or baggage, so we'll start adding. I mean, like producing this information inside the logs. So it's opt-in behavior. I mean, so by default, nobody will get this. I mean, if somebody really interested in that, they will have to opt in to get those.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep, I mean, looks pretty straightforward. Anybody any concerns with that?
It's just adding the two enum fields.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, seems fine.
There's nothing else on activity that we've added that would potentially need to be tracked as well, or this is all we've added so far since the last time?
This is this is the most important stuff in the activities that people may need in the logging, but nobody knows about in the future. Maybe somebody suggests something else, but I don't think, I mean, like, anybody will need something more than that.
But there are no other members on trace scopes or whatever that aren't already present in the enum.
No.
Yep.
All right then. This was easy then. Alrighty. Add back enum builder create type.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So I found this just by going through and annotating different reflection APIs. And so the issue here is when you're using reflection emit to build up an enum. Well, normally when you build up a type, we have create type and create type info. And I'm assuming create type info was added when we were doing reflection refactoring stuff. And we added back type builder create type, which returns system.type, but we never added back enum builder .create type, which we had in .NET Framework. And so this is just to be consistent with .NET Framework and between type builder and enum builder, we should probably put back create type on enum.
Oh, because I guess yeah. So basically, I think the idea was we assume probably that enum builder derives from type builder, but it doesn't. Yeah.
Right, it derives from type info.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, it's probably 0.01% of anybody even using reflection emit would hit this, but if they do.
No, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I think starting with Net Standard 2, when we basically gave up on the reflection split, the goal was to add all the APIs back, and then with 2.1, I think we tried to add back all of reflection emit. So yeah, that was the intent, but we clearly overlooked this API, so makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, Eric, I'm looking through the other builder types real fast, and this is the only one that you saw that was missing, right? Enum
Yeah.
builder. Okay.
I think so. Like we explicitly have it in the API compat baselines, and I thought I'll go back and look real quick, but I thought this was the only one I saw in API compat baselines.
Okay, yeah. From a really cursory examination, I think you're right. Okay.
Yeah, I also think that when we ran API compat, I think it never really supported this whole base type walk. So probably when we saw the validation, we also kind of assumed that it was a false positive, would be my guess. So yeah, I think that makes sense.
Oh, there's the Git module and Git signature also, I guess, in API compat. But
yeah, I'm very supportive of adding everything back. Like, I mean, there really is no reason why we wouldn't add. I mean, do you think the only reflection emit APIs that we killed for good are the ones that kind of imply persistence on disk? Everything else should probably be there. So if there's other overloads, we should probably add them as well.
it wasn't overloads, it's just straight up properties that aren't there. I'll paste the link in the chat.
Dun, dun, dun. Trying to find this chat.
So line 6 is the one that we're talking about here, the create type, and then.
Gotcha. And that was the other one. You said signature. Oh, the signature ones. I'm pretty sure those we actually looked at. But I think the discussion we had on them was. Yeah, I don't remember actually. So you just picked 6. What about the other ones? The first 5, are they false positives or?
So define dynamic module. That's the one that takes a bool, right, to say whether you're going to save it to disk or for the symbols. One of those.
I see. Okay. So then those one will be one of them that we actually deleted for a reason.
Yeah, the bool is emit symbol info.
Right, but then the second one seems like potential problem, right? If it doesn't exist in implementation, or is that because of our weird class hierarchy where the reference assembly and the implementation assembly don't match, so it exists on a base type or something? Because if we have a
Git module.
yeah, because I mean, if we have an API that we expose in the reference assembly, but you can't call and it blows up, that would be pretty bad. But something tells me it would have found it by now, if that were the case.
Well, this is comparing our ref API to.
Or import, right?
No, I thought it was comparing to basically .NET Framework.
Oh, I see now what it says. It says we have the API and the import, but don't have them in the reference assembly. Yeah, that seems fine, right? It just means we have more APIs in the implementation. Yeah, I don't know actually. Like, it seems like we should go over that list and maybe add some comments here and make sure that the things that are actual by design, we should probably state so. And then the rest we should probably just fix.
Git module and signature are both in. Yeah, we have methods for them in the implementation. They're just not in the ref. That's what you said. Yeah.
I mean, that's what the error message says, but like, I'm also not sure why we would even validate that, because that seems generally fine. Is it just self-consistency, so we don't accidentally add an API only to the implementation and forget to expose it?
Yep.
I see.
Yeah, in 1.0 we were okay with things being in the impl but not in the ref, and then I think we missed shipping. We missed putting a couple things that were supposed to be public as public, and then I feel like it was Eric St. John changed the thing to produce the also validate the other direction, that if it's public in the impl, it should be public in the ref, or you have to suppress it.
Okay, then how about this? I'll just say it's approved, but I added a comment that we should also either document or address the other violations in the baseline file. Because it seems like whatever is left in that baseline file, at least for me, it's not clear where some of these things exist. That might be bugs, or that might be because it's by design, but we will probably have the question in the future as well why we, damn it.
So for the other ones, if we decide we should probably add them back, I'll log in a new bug for it, and then we'll bring that to.
Yeah, either add them back or I don't know, somehow annotate the baseline file and saying, yep, they are by design and we will never address them, so we at least know that we're done with those.
Okay.
All right, so then this one is done. Actually, did I actually mark it approved, or did I just? I think I did, right? Yeah, I did. Allow using support REST from attribute on interfaces. Yes, I can probably talk to that one. So we added this attribute to annotate version-specific APIs, and the thing is that on the Xamarin side, they also have interfaces that are part of the iOS bindings. And so they map them to interfaces because that's the most logical thing to map some of the, Mac-specific APIs to. So it makes sense to actually put a marker on the interface itself that says this is a platform-specific thing. The reason we haven't done this initially is because our rationale was, well, it's an interface. Like, there is no, by definition, there's no code behind an interface, so that can't be platform-specific. But because of the way the bindings work, it would be beneficial for them if they could mark the interface itself. Now, just because we allow that doesn't mean we should use it everywhere else, but I also don't feel like that should be disallowed, if that makes sense.
Basically, these are types that we don't expose public classes for. And
Yeah, so I don't exactly know how you new them up. I assume you don't new them up, you just get them from somewhere else. And then when you use them, you know, you want to have checking that says, well, you can't use that guy because you're running on the wrong platform, right? And so you can't do that unless you are able to put the attribute on the interface itself.
It might also depend on if the interface is annotated with the special COM attributes that allow you to new up an interface, like you do for Office.
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm just like, but the scenario that we ran into was interfaces that don't have public types, and in general, it won't make sense to put these attributes on the interfaces, but in these cases, it does. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the same with abstract base types, right? Like there might be abstract base types where it makes sense to add an attribute, and then there's others where it wouldn't. So it's probably like one of those where it's like, yeah, we allow it on the attribute, but it doesn't mean you should apply it on every interface. So it seems fine to me.
I assume you don't want the analyzer to flow this across implementations of the interface?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat that?
If we put, we're not going to, if we put unsupported OS platform on IEnumerable, should every enumerable type now have the warning, or should it only give the warning if you're directly talking about an IEnumerable?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I would vote for the latter because an implementation can do more than one thing, and it would be weird to say that the implementation itself doesn't work on, you know, some OS. So
right.
Maybe I have a class which is iWindows interface and iMac interface, right? My class works. It's just one of the two interfaces is not relevant to you.
Yeah, that's the behavior that I want as well. I was just making sure that we were saying that this belonged to the interface and not flowed with the type hierarchy.
But what if somebody needs to be in the hierarchy too? What they will do?
Also apply it on their type?
So I'll go every type that for this interface and apply? It will be too much still.
I mean, why do you have an interface that you know never works on Windows? Unless you're COM. And then you probably didn't have a public type, so now you don't need to put the attribute anywhere else.
Another way to think of it is say that I knew up a list of T and then start using methods like add, remove, count, so on. Like, I'm not actually using iList of T. I'm using list of T. It's just those methods happen to implicitly implement the interface. But from the caller's perspective, like, I'm not touching the interface at all. In that perspective, I think it would make sense to separate them out and say, look, if you want the implementation to be blocked too, it has to be blocked because a caller might not be talking about the interface.
I mean, intuitively, I would say that if you mark an interface with this attribute, the analyzer should probably warn when you derive from that or when you implement the interface and don't have a restriction on the type itself. Now, if that is by design, I think it's okay to suppress, but I have a hard time thinking of cases where that would be useful, because it seems like at that point you're not really consistent with what you're saying. But it also seems to me that in the cases where you would want to apply the attribute, you probably don't have any real public types implementing that interface, so it's probably a non-concern. But I think, at least for me, it would make sense to say, if you implement this interface, you have to mark yourself as being platform specific. At least for the version number or a higher version number, right?
That sounds okay just from the perspective of, like, how many implementations of anything are there going to be? Maybe one or two ever. How many callers are there going to be? Possibly thousands. Making life harder for the implementers but easier for the callers, in my mind, is a good trade-off.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, my whole point about, like, should we give away in the attribute itself to tell about, like, if this is really scoped to the interface only, or it can be scoped to any implementer for this interface?
My original comment was more along the lines of, like, if I'm using an abstract, if I'm, as a caller, calling into a type's regular instance members who also happen to implement an interface which was marked as not supported, Like, I don't want the analyzer or anything else to have to go out of its way to figure out, like, well, did this method actually, like, happen to also fit into this vtable slot, blah, blah, blah? Because that's just creating unnecessary work for something that doesn't add value to me as a caller.
So I'd think that from the perspective of should it flow to the implementer of the interface, I don't think it should, because you could imagine that a type supports an interface with explicit checks in its own implementation that allows it to handle both Unix and Windows simultaneously, for example.
That seems fine.
There's nothing,
I think, but I think at that point the interface implementer should suppress that warning, because they have to do work to make that the case, right? So I think the analyzer shouldn't assume that it shouldn't basically do the computation. It should just say when you implement the interface, it should just flag the type, and if that's incorrect, then you suppress that thing and then you change the way you implement the type. But I think by default it would be weird if we mark an interface but then don't mark the implementations, because that's probably a bug. Because as Levi said, depending on how the call sites look like, the compiler may not see the API call through the interface. It might end up seeing it to the base type or to the derived or to the implementing type, in which case you no longer get a warning, which would be odd.
Yeah, it sounds reasonable to me to say that we want, if you are a type that is implementing an interface that has restrictions, that then if you don't have some notion of more restrictive restrictions, that it gives a warning and you have to suppress it. I think in the long term, we may find that we need another attribute that you can put on a type that says ignore the supported attributes from the following interface. So you don't end up with, you suppressed it once and then you added another interface and now you've lost the warning because you only meant to suppress it for that first interface that you'd added. Because you don't get to put the pragma suppress around, I don't think, you get to put it around the interface name on the right side of the colon. I think it goes around the type definition, so the left side of the colon. But I don't think there's going to be enough of this that it matters, so we don't need to design the 10 years from now feature now. Just a thing to think about.
The only thing I would add is we should probably do the same thing for unsupported OS platform attribute, right? Because it seems like if we do it for one, we should do it for the other. And I think there's one more, right? There's the obsoleted OS platform, or how do we call it?
We don't have that anymore.
Oh, we skipped that one?
We don't have unsupported OS anymore?
No, we have unsupported.
Don't have obsolete.
Oh, okay.
That one I think we skipped, yeah. So then okay, then it's only the unsupported one that they have to add it. Yeah.
Yep.
So cool. With the introduction of interface, that just leaves return value, parameter, generic parameter, and delegate that aren't allowed.
Right.
And delegate's the only one that I could think of that might be reasonable, just from the perspective of you can use delegates in interrupt scenarios with a special attribute that might make them apply to a single platform. That would be the unmanaged function pointer attribute that impacts how it's marshaled to native. But I'm not sure if that's important or not.
If you have a delegate that has that type and you use it as just a managed code calling managed code delegate, does it behave as a normal delegate?
Yes, but not if you use it in an interrupt scenario, for example, in, let's say, CS Win32 or Win32 metadata.
I thought the unmanaged one you couldn't do for managed code to managed code. I thought the runtime fails with that, or the compiler even fails.
This isn't function pointers. This is delegates with the unmanaged function pointer attribute that's existed since like .NET 1.0
Oh,
that
I
allows
see.
a delegate to be marshaled as a correct function pointer.
I see. I mean, maybe, but also is that something you would actually expose in your public API? That seems more like an implementation of something.
That probably depends. Some libraries want to expose one-to-one bindings, and others expose abstractions over them. I think WinForms, for example, leans towards the public the public surface area being more of an abstraction, like their delegates are over a ref message M rather than actually taking in the handle and the uint message.
I mean, the only thing why I'm somewhat hesitant to add delegate here is, I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but like, my concern is we have to now think about what that means for the analyzer, like basically what kind of code path would we now have to start to flag, because today we don't look at delegates in that sense, and it might make more sense to not allow it now, so that if later on we do add the analyzer to do this, we are not having to deal with legacy where some people already applied it to delegates, and now suddenly they get warnings in areas where they didn't get before. But like, it seems like if there's a scenario for delegates, we should design it, but then we should also design the analyzer semantics at the same time.
Yep,
and
that
I
makes
think
sense.
For now, I would just skip it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we'd need an example before it would make sense to add it.
All right, so then I guess I can just do this. Jump all the way to the bottom. All right. Actually, that's the wrong namespace, but should probably fix that. All right, so we have 10 minutes left. No, that's the one we just said we don't want to do. Yeah, I skipped the JSON one because I think they're the big thing here. So sequence equal.
So I can speak to this one. So we currently have a sequence equal method for span, read-only span on memory extensions, but it's constrained to T, I creatable of T, which means we can't then delegate it to it from places like link where we don't have such a constraint. And we just use, comparer of T or equality comparer of T dot default. So I'm suggesting we look at adding overrides that aren't overloads that aren't constrained. It's possible that has naming implications, in which case we would need to come up with different names.
I mean, you can't have a constraint-only overload, I don't think.
Right.
But if we made sequence equal of T that took, some spans and an I comparison, or I comparer or whatever, then we could constrain it differently, and now it has a different signature.
Right. So that's what I've suggested, is taking the actual comparer to use as the last argument.
Would we also remove the generic constraint from the original methods? Is that written in your proposal here?
It's not. We could, and then delegate to these guys, literally just delegate from one to the other and go through the comparer. I think that would result in worse code for reference types. We can do the right thing internally, sharing implementation with unsafe code and blah, 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 I think.
Yeah, I think we would just leave the current one as is, and then if you have a non-equatable type, but you've written an equality comparer, then you just call the 3-argument one.
Okay. And if the type is not, if the type doesn't implement I equatable, then pass null and we'll use equality compare default.
Right.
and hopefully it does the right thing.
Yeah, it's doing what you asked it to do.
Or we don't accept null, and you can pass equality compare.default.
I mean, if you implement I_equatable of t, and you pass null, then equality compare of t.default will use your I_equality compare of t. So it should just quote quote do the right thing. And then the other related question I had was, I didn't run into the situation, but I wanted to raise it, and that is we also have these memory extensions .sequence compared to. So we can consider, as long as we're doing these, we could do a similar thing for those and take an I_compare of t. But I didn't have a use case for that, so I didn't add it.
What does compare of t.default do?
It's similar. It looks for I_compare of t implementation. And it has some built-in knowledge of if you're comparing null against non-null, like what does that mean in terms of less than 0 or greater than 0? I don't remember what it decides.
And if you're just comparing arbitrary objects, it uses like the hash code or something?
I have no idea. Object compare t dot, I have no idea what it does. I've never tried to use it.
Because the regular equality compare of t.default eventually just goes to object.equals, right? Like it as a fallback. But like I'm racking my brain trying to figure out how on earth this would have a consistent ordering between two arbitrary objects. Let's try it is the answer.
It throws an exception.
What does link order do? Does it have a constraint or no?
What was the question, Jeff?
Regarding the issue we're talking about here, default compare behavior, what does link order by do?
It passes equality compare of, or a compare of t dot default.
But presumably you don't have to pass that, right?
If you don't pass one of those compare of t dot default, which then if it tries to use the I_comparable of t implementation on the type, and if it can't find an I_comparable of t or I_comparable whatever, I think it ends up throwing an exception. That's what the default object comparer thing does, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it makes sense. We're way deep here, but is there a way to say is comparable? It doesn't matter. It's
Yeah, I think you just literally do what you just said. You said X is I_comparable of X, right? Like the type itself.
I mean, because if it's not defined on the type, then how would it be defined? That's the only way to define it, right?
Yeah, the comparable basically only the comparable, like one of the operands is implicitly this one, and so the comparer is the one that takes both arguments, right? So so either the type itself implements I_comparable, or you have to pass in the comparer, which basically takes both arguments, right? That's the pattern.
Yeah, makes sense. So this API looks fine. My only hesitation here is you said if we need to invent new overloads. Do we know if we need to invent new overloads? How do we?
You mean for the sequence compared to?
No, I thought it was for sequence equal.
Sorry, I muddied the waters. I was suggesting we add. I wasn't giving the complete story. I'm proposing the two overloads that are shown here. There's no problem with them. What I was commenting on was if we didn't add that last compare argument, then we would need to come up with a new name, basically.
And so just to be clear, if I have a type that doesn't implement I_equatable of t, and
you need to pass a third argument here, either null or equality compare of t dot default or some other compare.
Okay, and it's the fact that you always require the third argument here that means we don't have overload issues.
Right.
I don't know. I actually don't know the C# rules about this. If we defaulted that last argument to null, would it complain?
That's what I'm checking right now, actually.
Okay.
Okay. Because I don't.
No, I don't think
it
it's
would complain
complaint.
because the generic one that you don't meet the constraint should not be eligible. So you either have an exact match if you meet the constraint, or the default parameter. I mean, granted, Levi's test will tell all, but I think it should work.
Yeah, it looks like it's working just fine.
So in that case, we could add equals null at the end of each of those and just kind of have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Great. Sounds good to me.
Which no also means we can never drop the constraint.
No, we could, because then you'll have exact match versus the default parameter didn't matter because there was never a context that it applied. An exact match is better than a default parameter.
I guess that's fair, yeah.
You're saying we could drop the constraint on the existing API?
We could in the future if we wanted to. I don't remember why it's there, but I don't like dropping constraints because you can't undo that one.
Yeah, and as I think Stephen pointed out, that could result in worse performance for reference types, right? Because they'll have to do it.
If we went through the default comparer, we're not going to, at least the way the current system works, we wouldn't be able to de-virtualize all the way through.
Yeah, I wonder if we were trying to avoid doing implicit equality comparisons on structs, and that we said we only wanted this if you said you were comparable yourself, which you should be on a struct, but that we didn't want the default equals ever getting called. And if that's the case, then we would not add the third parameter because we'd make you go out of your way to do more things.
I don't know what's bad about letting someone say how they want things compared.
Yeah, I think it's good to add the overlay. The question is the constraint on the current one, and do we want the defaulted parameter and all that jazz.
So two thoughts on that. One, again, is what does link do? Like if you do a group by or something like that, does it work on structs that don't provide I-equatable? And two is, if we did want to prevent that, how would we do that without making other scenarios more difficult? I mean, I think a very simple scenario here that it seems worth enabling is just T is some reference type, possibly object. And I just want to I want to find out if the span contains the same set of reference types or not. And in that case, there's no point in me supplying a custom compare. I just want to do the default reference comparison.
Yeah, I mean, you could pass, I think we made the reference comparer singleton somewhere.
You mean the .default property?
That somewhere we have the, hey, I'm a reference-only comparison.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could just pass default comparer, right? It's just that's an extra step for what seems like a pretty simple case.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud of if the reason we had the I-equatable constraint is to avoid the relatively expensive implicit struct equals, because people using spans are obviously caring about performance, so they don't want the trap. Then that would mean we wouldn't default the last parameter, and hey, you explicitly called this one that is doing things. You didn't get the fast one. That was on you, but.
I buy that. I'm just wondering, is there anywhere else where we do something like what you're talking about? In other words,
but Link is never about performance. Link is about convenience, and the span was about performance, and we could decide that that's not true anymore. But
true, but sequence equal is not necessarily going to be performant, right? I mean, if you've got a really big sequence, it's going to be expensive.
But there's expensive, and then there's oh my god, expensive. And
true.
I think
but it's also, you can write a really stupid equatable implementation.
Sure.
I mean, if you've written a struct that doesn't have I-equatable, and you're using sequence, and you do any kind of equality operation on it, and the performance sucks because you get the default implementation, I think that's kind of on you.
Yeah.
So consensus is add the overloads with default arguments.
I think so, yeah. And you know, if things don't work out, we can always reconsider them.
Yeah,
Sure.
sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, it works for me. I mean, normally I would say we need to make sure it works in other languages, but given that these are all span-based APIs, probably fine as is.
Sweet. Jeff, I'm doing this for you. This is so you never have to track down another one of those. A test takes 2 minutes that should take, 2 microseconds.
Did we also implicitly approve compare to at the same time, or do you want to reserve that for a different talk?
I didn't have a need for it, so I didn't add it. Maybe we hold off until we do.
Sounds good.
All right, so I think now we are at the mark. So now we can fill the remaining hour on our favorite issue.
Hey.
I'm going to build the world's greatest bike shed.
I don't know. I've seen bike sheds that are ginormous. So where we were last time was, I think let me actually find the notes now. I think I commented on this, right? Did I not? Yeah. So we said, okay, let's have a read-only struct. We need to decide what we do with the await behavior, or whether we just basically remove the type itself and just have named arguments. One of the reasons was because value task and task might differ here, so we may want to have different named arguments in both sets. And then there was this other concern of the analyzer, where we should just make sure that people pass the cancellation token properly through.
Yeah, I think there are basically 3 high-level options being considered. One is 2 of what you described. So one is you have a struct, you pass the struct in to a configure await. The other is you have overloads of configure await that take all the arguments that you care about for that particular thing. And then the third is going back to a bunch of individual with methods, with cancellation, with timeout. You still need configure await for some of these things because they can only be about the await, like continue on capture context, force async, suppress exceptions. So that's sort of in addition to, rather than instead of.
Sorry, explain that last part again. I didn't quite get that.
There are certain things, like you can implement cancellation token and timeout if you wanted to by creating a new task that combines the previous task and whatever the additional thing is. The cancellation token or the timeout, right? So you create a task that will complete when either the original task completes or when the cancellation token has cancellation requested. But for some of these things, they can't be represented in a task at all. So there's no way to build into task itself the idea that continuations should continue on the captured context or not. There's no way to build into task itself a way to say all continuations, regardless of whether the task is completed or not, should run asynchronously. And there's no way to build into task itself all awaits on this task should suppress throwing of exceptions. Those 3 things are really relegated to the awaiter, since they're very much explicitly about configuring the await behavior.
Couldn't you do the suppress exceptions by just try catch?
You mean the user could?
Yeah.
Sure.
But it was still thrown.
Right. The request for suppress exception is so there isn't one thrown at all.
Okay.
I mean, force async, you could basically effectively address by adding in an await task yield afterwards. So there are other ways to express these things, but you can't build them into the task. There's no way to create a task that embodies those concepts. Whereas in theory, you could build a task that embodied the cancellation token or timeout. So it comes down to like whether we want to try and build some all-inclusive struct that we can add more stuff to in the future, and potentially, if we think, I'll try and reserve my opinions or biases, if we think that the configure await approach would help with discoverability or wouldn't cause people to think they were somehow impacting the original task. There's the overloads of configure await where we want to be more fine-grained about either having overloads that only offer a subset of things, making certain combinations easier to express, not exposing options on task-like types that don't make sense. And then there's adding the with timeout or with cancellation methods, potentially in addition to a configure await that deals with those other three things. And then, you can, the pros for that is you can say with timeout, with cancellation on their own, use them in any context you want. The downside is you're probably paying more for that. You're potentially confusing people who think that with timeout is somehow impacting the original task or with cancellation is somehow impacting the original task. And if you cared about those other three things, you still need a configure await.
Yeah, I mean, my main piece of feedback here, I guess, is I have seen lots and lots of asks for the cancellation and timeout behavior. And people, A, people seem to really want it. B, when they find out there's no kind of like built-in way to do this automatically, they tend to go off and build something themselves and often do something really bad. And so I would love to see us have a way to expose this that is discoverable and straightforward to use. And the way the API is structured here, where it's you have to effectively do .configure await and then and then go figure out this struct that has a bunch of unrelated properties on it, seems like it's unnecessarily complicated for that scenario. So there were two other concerns you raised about that. I think one was perf. I don't see why the perf needs to necessarily be any different. It could be that if we have, if it's a like when, or like a cancel when or something like that, then that could literally just wrap the configure await API proposed here. In other words, we could structure the API in such a way that there's like a full-blown, low-level API that exposes every option that we want to, which is basically what you've got here, I think. And then just some simple helpers on top of that allow you to accomplish very, simple and common tasks like setting up cancellation.
Sure. What I meant was if we exposed a with cancellation that returned a task and we exposed a with timeout that returned a task and someone wanted both, and they did .with timeout, .with cancellation, they've likely now created two tasks where they only needed one, for example.
That's true. The reason you would want that is because you explicitly want a task as opposed to just a random awaitable, because you're going to wait all, or you're going to do like a when all or when any or something like that on it?
Well, I think the argument that's been made for, and I'm one of the ones who's made it, for the configure await approach is it's very, very, very rare that you actually care about that task.
I agree.
Yeah.
Which is why I wouldn't by default here create a task, right?
Right.
Avoid
and that's
perfect.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's how we ended up at configure await. The whole purpose of, if you're not creating a task, then you're configuring the await, and so configure await.
Okay, but now we're getting into naming questions, right?
Right. Basically, we're scratching off. That direction leads you to not expose the with methods, and then you're back at adding a method that returns an awaitable. And we have one of those, and it's called configure await. So this is over. So I think if we go that route, I would be hard pressed to come up with anything better than just an overload of the existing thing.
An overload of the existing thing meaning what?
An overload of configure await. Whether it took a struct or individual arguments is the next question.
Right. So what's wrong? So here's my proposal. Why could we add something like we were tossing around the term abandon, I think, at the end of the last meeting. Could we add something like abandon await or abandon await when, or something that includes the two words abandon and await, so that it's clear that you are, because the objections I've heard to other names here is you want to make sure that that people understand that the cancellation is applying to the await and not to the underlying task you're awaiting, which I think abandon has some value in doing that. And then as well as explicitly saying await there, right? Because by saying abandon await, you are saying I'm going to just basically stop awaiting this thing because the cancellation token fired. And and then implement that as just a simple wrapper around configure await.
Around a public configure await that takes a struct?
Yeah.
So you're suggesting the full-blown configure await plus struct, and then helper methods that are called abandon await?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, the other way you could go is to go full-blown, just expose each of these as its own individual method. I kind of like that approach too, but it seems like I don't have a strong opinion on that. My high order here is just make the simple thing simple.
Well, you can't have each thing be an individual method because you can't chain them. They don't return the thing that they operated on.
You would have to add all the methods in multiple places. You'd have to add them onto tasks and onto the awaitable itself.
Yeah, but that's not hard, right?
It's not hard. It's just more kludgy. I mean, and I say that having done that already with what we did for async enumerables.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, I have a viscerally negative reaction to the abandon terminology, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, as a high-level concept, I think it's totally fine. Like, assuming that we think that the struct works because we're okay with saying value task throws if suppress exceptions is true or whatever. Assuming that we think that the struct has value as this tells you all the options, etc., and or it's reusable, then convenience overloads that call it for you seem totally fine.
Yeah, I would just want them to actually be overloads, like configure await bool cancellation token, in addition to configure await behavior or whatever.
Sure. But I mean, if we ignore the fact that we were adding the struct one at the same time, it could be that we had named the thing abandon, and then we like, oh, let's make the struct unify all these things, and configure await's the best thing. Anyway, like that's the roof of the bike shed. I think right now we're still working on the foundation.
I hear what you're saying. I just don't think that configure await seems, if I'm a casual user and I see configure await, I mean, maybe we've trained them already with the configure await false as exists today, but I'm not sure how many people actually use that in practice. I'm a user and I'm trying to figure out, hey, I want to, add some sort of cancellation to my await here. I think configure await is a scary name that's going to scare me off. And
I mean, the question is, would we want to encourage users to casually cancel their awaitables?
I would say no, but I brought that up last time, so you all know my thoughts on that.
Well, no, we shouldn't. We need to be very thoughtful about it, because you often will end up leaving things in place.
Yeah, what I'm concerned about is you pass a resource into the asynchronous method, you abandon the await, those resources are still in use. Like, you've abandoned the await, but some underlying I/O operation is still working on those buffers. Like, if you return them to the array pool, God help you. Like, you've now corrupted global app state. Hooray. That said, like, is this discussion right now predicated on the idea that the await behavior struct as proposed here actually seems okay, and we're just trying to figure out, like, convenience extension methods to operate on it?
Well, I think there are concerns with the struct as it is as well. I raised one last time that, like, this, the suppress exceptions behavior is not ideal for value task. But exposing the struct suggests that we want to be able to reuse it in multiple places.
Right, but we do have the option of throwing if it's true and the value task configure await.
We could do that. I guess it hints that if one makes the argument that the struct is there because you're going to be adding more stuff in the future, potentially, then the more stuff you add, the more likely it is that those things won't play nicely with wherever it's being used. But that's a slippery slope argument, so, you know.
What is the use case for a suppressed exception?
It's basically not wanting to have to write the try-catch, deal with the first chance exception, and the overhead of the exception getting thrown. The most often case I've heard of when people ask for it is either perf, they don't want the exception thrown, or they want to do their own thing and potentially throw their own exception afterwards, again, without the expense of the thing being thrown. So, for example, if you're dealing with a task that actually does contain multiple exceptions, if you await it, it only propagates one. So someone wants to be able to await it without anything being thrown and then throw their own aggregate. Today you can do that. You try await T, catch, and in the catch you throw T dot exception, which will be an aggregate exception. But it's a little bit more code, and there's a perf overhead to it.
But with a suppress exception, how would you even get the exception?
Await T dot suppress exception, throw T dot exception. Or if T dot is faulted, throw T dot exception.
Okay, the exception is stored on the task. I forgot that,
yeah. But that's also where it's a problem for value task. If this is a value task, you're really not supposed to touch the value task after you've awaited it.
I mean, is it really then it sounds like I heard two reasons. One is convenience, the other is performance. Is there really that much of a performance difference?
I mean, it's one more exception throw. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if it's the exception is being thrown somewhere, right? So there's at least some overhead happening in the fact that somebody has decided to throw an exception.
Yeah, and it's probably, if you're dealing with async, you're probably dealing with multiple levels of state machines, and it's going to get thrown and caught at every level.
Exactly. I mean, if we think this is a feature that it sounds to me like perhaps this is one we should cut, right? It sounds like there's complications and that the value here isn't huge. I mean, if it was simple to do, I would say sure, go do it. But if it causes us pain, then why would we try and do it as opposed to just telling people, hey, use try-catch, that's what it's for?
I would also like to raise another concern about the suppress exceptions design in particular, if I may. There is another concern, basically around, I guess, type safety in this case. Consider the example where you have a task where the T type is an unnullable reference type, and you await it with suppressed exceptions. Lo and behold, the return value would be null, but you wouldn't have, your usual nullability warnings applied to the rest of the async method. So I'm assuming that for the use cases that we're looking at, it might not be an issue, but I think it's certainly something we should take into consideration as well.
By the way, Emo, I muted you on Teams because your microwave was annoying. Yeah, I mean, it does, the setting suppress exceptions would completely destroy nullability annotations, and since we just spent a lot of time trying to get them in, that does sound like another reason to not add this feature.
I mean, I'm not wed to the feature, and it's a fine argument. That said, there are plenty of ways that nullable reference types are fallible. So
sure. Really, yes, really what I don't want is us to add it and it to get on value task and it be like, well, 97% of the time when someone's doing this, it didn't matter. But then that 1% where the value task completion source has released its tracking handle and reused it, and you're now getting some other state once you try to read the exception. Like that's what I really want to avoid.
Yeah.
Assuming we went down the await behavior struct design, would it perhaps make sense to expose separate structs for task and for value task? that would give us more flexibility in terms of what behaviors we want to expose for each of them.
We could. It's one more thing that puts in your face what kind of thing you're dealing with. Like, it's, for the most part, if you say, await stream.read async, you don't really have to know whether it's returning, you're using the overload that returns a task or a value task. But now you need to know because the dot that you do after it requires you to pass a different type.
I would think that if we end up having a split in capability, we would be able to use an analyzer to call that out. To say, like, look, I know that you were chaining this off of a task versus a value task, and then within that chain you set a property or called an extension method that doesn't make sense.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
But I'm also fine saying suppress exceptions has too many warts. And any one of them individually may not be a big deal, but together the proverbial straw.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, can you scroll up? What are the things that are still on the struct, if we had the struct?
Sorry.
So there's
Boolean, a timeout, a cancellation token, and a thing I don't remember.
So the cancellation, yeah. So the tuples. I'm wondering if the struct should actually have a copy constructor. That way, if you wanted to implement your own extension method, you could just change a single property while leaving all the rest the same.
Well, I'm wondering further. So, continue on capture context. I know people hate it, but it's critical. Force async and suppress exceptions. We just said we're going to get rid of. Force async, that's really like a nice to have for some very niche scenarios. We wrote our own awaiter at one point to do it on, I think, CryptoStream and something else, and then we ditched it later. So if we were to get rid of those two things, now you're down to cancellation token and timeout plus the bool that we always have. And I start to wonder whether we just have configure await bool cancellation token timeout and call it a day.
Is this the captured context, is the synchronization context or the security context, execution context?
Synchronization context and task scheduler.
Would you ever want an unsafe equivalent that jumps off of the execution context as well?
You can't. Well, nothing can't, but it's not the awaiter that flows it. It's the build.
Yes, you're right. Okay.
And you can do that today by suppressing the execution context, right?
Right. And on it, every await, the awaiter itself, has onCompleted and unsafe onCompleted, and 99.999% of the time, the compiler is always generating a call to unsafe onCompleted anyway. So
yeah,
not actually floating at the await. It's the builder that layers it on.
Got it.
Now you could potentially teach our builders to recognize these awaiters specifically and then look to see whether those settings were applied and, stop its flow. But that's a whole other ball of wax.
Sure. The context behind that question is I know that the Kestrel folks specifically have been asking for some much lower level threading APIs in order to remove as much overhead as possible. And I wonder if this struct, were we to keep it around, might be an appropriate place to expose some of those.
Maybe. The main place that we've been getting requests for suppressing execution context flow, which as Jeff mentioned, you can say execution context dot suppress flow. But the main place we've been getting requests for that isn't to do with overhead. It's to do with long-running things that end up rooting async locals for longer than would otherwise be desired. So you launch some long-running operation. You happen to have some expensive resource in an async local, and now that long-running operation is keeping that thing alive forever.
Yeah, we had that exact scenario in WebSockets in ASP.NET Desktop. We actually had to dump the synchronization context as a result of that. Okay.
And the solution to some of those things maybe don't use async locals.
Sometimes it's don't use async locals. Sometimes it's explicitly call execution context dot suppress flow and restore flow around your operation. And sometimes it's we have an unsafe overload that basically just doesn't call execution context dot capture, and in some cases, for more prominent APIs, we've explicitly added those at strong requests.
Yeah.
So I'm slightly lost. Are we trying to justify every single property here and convince ourselves that the only thing we truly need is two of them? Or is the idea that...
I was going down the argument of, well, the last two, we sort of said we don't like the last one because it's problematic.
Right.
The fourth one, I'm saying, I had added that to the list in my initial proposal and then convinced Eric to incorporate it. And now I'm suggesting, but it's very niche, and it's possible to do it in various ways on one's own. And if you get rid of those two, now you're basically left with the existing the bool we currently have plus a timeout and a cancellation token, and you could just add those as arguments to configure await.
Well, and even the timeout you could just do you could get rid of timeout and just say create a cancellation token from a timeout, right? Is there any...
You could. The primary concern I have with that is that's one of the things we see people frequently get wrong. You end up creating a you say like new cancellation token source with your timeout, and you say just pass in .token, and they neglect to dispose of that cancellation token source afterwards. And now the timer is still hanging around.
So the benefit you get from specifying a timeout explicitly as opposed to just creating a cancellation token is we'll dispose it for you and make sure that it doesn't leak and hang around.
That's right. And the other benefit, if you happen to need both a cancellation token and a timeout, which is rarer, it happens, but it's rarer, there's additional work you would have to do to combine the incoming cancellation token with the cancellation token source for your timeout. And then you would need to dispose, that resulting thing as well, and so we would handle that internally. But go ahead. Sorry.
Do we still need the struct just from the point of view that someone might need to get the original cancellation token or timeout so that they can chain?
I don't understand the question.
So if I say cancel after some time span or some cancellation token, and then cancel after, again, a different time span or a different cancellation token, am I going to have to... I guess I don't have to chain those because I would just have two cancellations registered, wouldn't I? Okay, never mind.
Yeah,
I talked myself out of it.
You could ask the cancellation exception, did it cancel because of the token that I already know about? And it would say no, and then that meant it was from your timeout or something else.
Yeah, I talked myself out of needing that.
Yeah, Steve, is there any difference between whatever force async would do and await task.yield?
The only difference, well, there would be a small perf difference that's probably inconsequential, in that you would basically have to make another trip through the state machine to get to the task yield, whereas it would just sort of be built in. That's minor. And then the other one would be we don't currently expose the equivalent of await thread pool, basically. Like await thread pool.hop or whatever you want to call it, that would basically force your continuation to run on the thread pool. That is what await task yield does, unless there is a synchronization context or task scheduler present, in which case it will schedule to those. And so, and we don't have like await task.yield.configure await false. So force async would basically be the equivalent of await task.yield.configure await false, effectively. Okay. But again, it's actually not hard to add this functionality if you really want it. Like doing this optimally is basically what we did, which was create a custom struct that wraps the underlying awaiter, delegates everything to the underlying awaiter, except for is completed, which you hardcode to false.
Yeah, maybe instead of force async, we want task.yield with a boolean continue on captured context, so that UI applications could use that as an easy force async. We don't have to improve it here. I'm just thinking of if we're cutting things off of this struct, and the only time that there's a difference between task.yield and force async is UI applications or anywhere else that there's a scheduler, then maybe we want to give them the easy way instead of this boilerplate, but it takes like 50 steps.
I think where I'm finding my head, like walking back my own comments, I think I basically once we introduced the concept of a struct, I kind of found myself thinking, oh, we can just throw all these other things that people have been wanting onto this without really thinking hard about whether each of them on their own is merited. And at some point, you get rid of enough of them, and the struct becomes kind of superfluous.
I would say, though, I'm repeating myself here. I would say that the primary motivation on my side for using await behavior is to explicitly make it more difficult to pass cancellation tokens or timeouts to the awaitable.
That's fair.
Yeah, and also to what you just said, Steve, like even if we don't end up shipping it, I think it's a good exercise in how extensible such a struct can be in a few years' time.
Yeah, but I think if we get down to only 3 things, that the struct's not worth it yet.
Not yet, but we would leave the option open to add it in the future, and now we've brainstormed ideas for what we might want it to look like going forward.
All right, so I think Steve's current best proposal, and then we'll let Steve and Jeff box over the name, is configure await bool defaulted time span defaulted cancellation token.
Yes. Well, not defaulted time span. That one's hard. Defaulted time span 0.
Which do you think some people may want to be like, I wish you were already canceled instead of 0 for not canceled?
Well, and I don't know that anyone would explicitly pass a constant 0, but they, or time span .0. But if there was math being done to subtract remaining time, you might end up at 0.
Fair enough. So that would be configure await Boolean cancellation token and configure await Boolean time span defaulted cancellation token.
Or you just take a nullable time span?
Nullable time span. Hey, I'm glad we solved this problem 15 years ago and that I forgot about it. Okay, so defaulted nullable time span and defaulted cancellation token.
Just to be clear, we do think there's a scenario where somebody would want to pass both the cancellation token and the timeout.
They exist, but they are rare.
Okay, but it's worth having an overload that takes both, as opposed to just 2 different overloads that one takes a cancellation token, one takes a timeout.
Well, I think multiple chaining multiple methods together here, I think, is pretty ugly.
I'm not talking about chaining. I'm talking about just not allowing. Sorry, what?
You're proposing it as an alternative. Give us a cancellation token or a timeout, and if you want both, you have to combine them yourself.
Exactly.
I see. That's an option. As is another overload that, 3 overloads. Bool cancellation token, bool timeout, cancellation token. I don't have a strong opinion. The places that you end up with both of them are usually some, buried deep somewhere in your code path, and you either have been passed in a remaining amount of time and you have your own sort of internal source of cancellation, or you are passed in, an external source of cancellation and you have your own kind of limit you want to apply or some such thing. But I don't feel strongly about it.
I would shoot for something simple that we can repeat. So I would try to avoid playing tricks with overload groups, because that will also get progressively harder as we add more stuff to it.
Yeah, I think it's once we if we decided to then bring force async back in, that now it's like we've decided the three things were the important things, and complicated things then use the struct. I mean, we could argue that other complicated things are worthy of proper overloads, but I don't think we would go full combinatoric as future options come on board.
So where are we currently?
So what I'm hearing is we would have, bool continue on captured context. We would have a defaulted cancellation token and a defaulted nullable timeout. Did I miss something?
That was one proposal. The other was just two new overloads: bool cancellation token, bool timeout, and the other was 3 new overloads: bool cancellation token, bool timeout, bool timeout cancellation token.
And to be clear, all those overloads would also include bool continue on captured context. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably colored. My view of this is probably colored, but I don't want to expose a configure await method that doesn't take the bool.
Yeah, that seems fine. Do we expose one that defaults it to false? Because it seems like a fairly common scenario here is I just want to set a cancellation token or a timeout. I don't really want to adjust the continue on captured context default behavior, and I don't really want to think about it either.
I mean, we could, but in order to specify a subsequent parameter, you would have to name it. So instead of saying configure await false comma cancellation token, you would say configure await cancellation token : cancellation token.
Yeah, I don't know which is better. That seems, neither seems ideal, but.
Well, I guess it depends on how strongly a few people know what to pass in for the first argument, right? If we think they know that, they can quickly pick a value that is right. Otherwise, my concern is they will just throw in some random value, right? At which point you might be better off just saying, just pass in the only thing you care about.
And default to true.
Yeah, I guess that depends on what we want to do. I guess, yeah.
I think it would have to depend. It would have to default to the same thing as not specifying configure await at all, which is true.
Yeah, that's, I guess, fair.
Which, I mean, we could do it if we want to go default all the way. Of course, that means you can now say .configure await open paren close paren.
Yeah, that one we should probably just have analyzer for and saying don't do that.
I mean, this is kind of why I like having this be a different method, like having the one that takes a cancellation token or a timeout be a different method than configure await, because it seems like you should have. It seems like it's fairly clean to have one method that deals with cancellation and another that deals with the captured context, and it's just that we've chosen to call the one that deals with captured context configure await, whereas if we called the other one, abandon await, which I know you hate, but if we can come up with a better name for it, then and chain them. So the chaining is simpler now because we only have a couple options. We have fewer options.
I mean, I don't understand what buys us.
Well, the specific thing I was suggesting it buys us is it makes it easy to say something like .abandon await cancellation token. And not have to think about captured context at all, or set captured context explicitly, or deal with a named parameter or anything like that.
Right, but would you then want, because that's going to return some awaitable, do you then think that we need to support the combinatoric setting of all of these options on all possible awaiters, awaitables, or, because the problem is if you want configure await false and the timeout, either we made it so that you could chain these things, which is we can write some sort of build validator or analyzer that helps us not screw it up, but it's a lot of work that won't sustain itself. Versus if they're all overloads of one thing, we can look at it and it's obvious.
I was going to say, if the concern is that you're being forced to pass the bool, then, I mean, if that was really a concern, we could have configure await cancellation token, configure await time span. It's just a different name from what's being proposed.
I think that would be a slight improvement, yeah.
I guess, I don't know. I share Eric and Levi's consternation about making this too simple.
I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think it's going to be that simple, right? Because I think to me the saving grace is it's always sufficiently ugly, right? I'm always more concerned when something looks appealing, and then people kind of are excited to kind of like just do the one thing and then they screw it up. But this one, because you have to basically do it right before you do the await, like the code always looks somewhat ugly. So I don't think that people are very likely to do it just in case.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but when people write this themselves, are they just creating a task specifically for cancellation and then doing when any? I assume that's what they're generally doing, right?
Yeah, for cancellation token, usually what happens is you create a new task completion source that will be, or you'll have an async method that returns a task, and you'll have a task completion source that you complete when the cancellation token is signaled, and you await the original task and the cancellation task, and then hopefully you remember to dispose your cancellation token source and check which task completed and throw the appropriate exception or return or whatever. And similar for timeout with a timer, or generally with a task.delay. So await task.whenAny with the original task and a task created from task.delay, and then hopefully you remember that you actually should have created your task.delay with a cancellation token. So you construct a cancellation token source and you pass that into your task.delay, and then you cancel the cancellation token source. If that made any sense.
Yeah, the last part I didn't quite get. Why does task.delay need a cancellation token source?
Well, normally you're adding a timeout to things that are going to complete really fast, and you create your timeout that's really long, like 90 seconds, and so your operation completes really fast, and then your task.delay has a timer that's just sitting there waiting to fire in 90 seconds, and isn't going to go away until it fires.
Yeah,
so
you end up with a million tasks that. Now that's a problem with, well, I don't know.
Problem with task delay as a timeout mechanism.
I mean, getting to the earlier point about needing to understand that you haven't actually canceled the underlying task. I mean, anyone who uses when any do that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Jeff. There was a noise in the background.
The nice thing about using when any for this is that it forces the user to understand a little bit more that that the existing task isn't actually going to be canceled. You're just going to be notified when the first task of the set completes. Not sure what
while that's true, two thoughts in response to that. Normally, one person writes it and puts it in a helper method that everyone else uses, await task dot with timeout, in some helper library. And then the other is, now granted, I get called in to look at the code usually when there's something wrong, but 90% of those with timeout methods that I've seen are wrong.
And they're wrong because they don't cancel the cancellation token source, or?
Yeah, exactly. It usually comes to us with my app is spending 20% of its time in timers. Timers are broken. And we say, all right, well, dump your timers. And there's, a million of them that are all from task.delay from a with timeout method.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate, and I realize I'm super far afield here, so feel free to tell me to shut up. Could we what if we said do when any, but we add a cancellation token and our timeout to when any? And we say, if you want to do this, go do when any.
I was about to suggest that.
We could do that. There's another issue open for when any with a timeout. It's still non-trivial boilerplate, but it would alleviate that particular issue. It would alleviate needing to create the cancellation token source, pass it to a task.delay, and remember to dispose the timer.
What's the complexity? On the caller, not on us.
So what are you passing to when any?
So await task.whenAny. If we want to keep the params of it, we have to move them to front parameters. A timeout, comma, some tasks.
Yeah, but
you would need to turn
one task, right?
Yeah, I mean, we'd probably want to add an overload for the one task so we don't create the array to wrap one task.
Right, so part of the complexity is you're now forcing someone to look to when they only have one thing. And we've already talked about not wanting to make people use when any when there's one thing. But, logically there's a second thing that is a timeout. I just don't know that people think about it that way. And then the complexity is then if task.whenAny timeout comma t does not equal t, throw timeout exception, else await task.
Because it returns the task that completed.
Right.
So that means that the caller would also have to turn a value task into a task in order to call this API?
Yeah, we've explicitly said we're not adding when any for value tasks. Now,
okay, so
now maybe, yeah.
So there are a few intermediate steps that the caller has to do.
Couldn't you do something? Sorry, go ahead.
That's all I had.
Couldn't you do something hacky like return -1 on timeout or cancellation?
It returns the task object, not the task index.
Okay, sorry.
But there's the other problem. I mean, the problem with these combinators over something like value task is they necessarily need to hook up a continuation. If you then force the user to go back to the thing afterwards, you're setting up the exact situation we say shouldn't be done with value task, which is hook up two continuations or look at them twice or whatever. We can handle that ourselves internally in a configure await that's built into value task. But it becomes sketchy suggesting other people do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you would want to do then is, at the original await, you would probably want, when you get the value task, you probably want to turn it into a task, throw out the original value task that you got because you don't want to touch it anymore from this point onward. And right. I think, Steve, the analyzers you have actually help with that already. But
this usage, it would flag this usage. Well, theoretically, I'm not sure I've tested that particular case, but it should flag that usage, and it would. You should be calling as task, as you're saying.
Yeah, but now we've put the developer in a situation where they're doing something that is suboptimal than having used just straight up tasks in the first place, I think, which is what we wanted to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, we're walking a fine line here. Like, I get there are multiple concerns being expressed. And in particular, like, we don't want to encourage developers to use this functionality because it necessarily means that there may be some ongoing operation that's using resources that gets left behind. So we don't want to encourage developers to do it, but at the same time, developers do it. We do it ourselves all over the place. I mean, the number of timeout after, with timeout, with cancellation methods that are defined across our tests and our libraries, and it's everywhere. So people do it, and then a lot of people do it wrong, and so we're walking this fine line with. We don't want a lot of people to do it, but they are going to do it because we know they are. We want them to do it right and not have to write a lot of code to do it.
When you say wrong, is it functionally incorrect or is it mainly a performance issue?
It's generally a performance issue in that they leak resources.
Got it. So the GC will eventually kick in and clean them up, but their application might suffer.
Well, not necessarily. Like, timers are rooted. So these timers are rooted. So
got it. Okay.
Until the timer fires, it's not going anywhere.
Okay.
I'm trying to think if there's ever been a quote-unquote functional issue that I've seen. assuming you don't consider leaks functional.
Well, eventually.
I mean, the implementations of that team usually give the right answer. So from that perspective, they're functional.
They're correct in effect, but not in side effect.
Sure.
So, what is wrong with the original proposal, which is basically we have one overload of configure await that takes everything that you can do, and then we have one overload per simple thing people want to do that just takes one thing. Because it seems to me that's kind of the easiest thing for us to evolve, and it kind of makes the call sites reasonably understandable. I mean, the argument still stands that people think that might be too easy for people, but yeah, I think there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, like if you want people to discover the API and you want to be able to, they want to be able to do it, I think at that point it just becomes a question of where you put the API, but it seems like a sufficiently obscure place to put it.
So would that be the nullable time span and defaulted cancellation token after the current bool that's there, and then either same name overloads that take only a timeout or only a cancellation token, or give them a different name so that they look differently discoverable?
Well, what I would do is I would have one overload of configure await that takes everything, where everything is being defaulted, including the continue on captured context. And then I would add two other overloads, basically one for cancellation token non-defaulted and one for time span not defaulted. And so that basically now means if you just want to suppress, either capture context, you just want to have a timeout, or you just want to have a cancellation token, you only have one argument you have to pass in. If you want some combination thereof, you have to deal with the longest one, but then you just pick the ones that you want to use. And then so this now means if we add another, a fourth thing, let's say our favorite one, the fourth async one, we would say, yep, we would basically add another overload that takes all four of them now, everything being defaulted. The previous one we remove the defaults, and then we add another. I guess we can't add the simple overload because bool is already taken, right? But that seems okay probably.
Personally, I don't like there ending up being a configure await that has 0 formal parameters.
I mean, that's fair, although maybe that's also not the worst in the world.
It would look confusing to the caller, like configure await without passing in any configuration.
Which is just a no-op that returned a wrapper awaitable. Like it. I mean, granted, that's what true does, but yeah, I think I would go for it's a slightly ugly signature, but it saves someone from doing the I meant to do configure await and actually do something, and then they just kind of walked away. That the method does nothing if you ended up calling it with all default parameters is where it feels weird to me. So I would do required Boolean and then defaulted other things, personally.
I mean, we could also have a very low-tech solution to this. We could just define an overload of configure await that be obsolete, editor browse never, that takes no arguments, right? In which case they immediately get a warning if they do it. Right? I mean, that's one way of doing it. I mean, my only concern with basically having, force people to pass and continue on captured context is that they now have to pick a value for this, and they'll be confident they pick the correct one.
But they'd only hit that case when they want to specify both the timeout and the cancellation token, and Steve's gut feeling seems to be that that's rare.
Would we just, instead of having a parameterless overload that's obsolete, would we have an analyzer to say, look, you didn't pass anything here, what did you mean?
Well, we could.
Yeah, I said low tech, right? As in, it would save us lines of code, but yeah, that would clearly be the preferred solution, so we don't have weird APIs.
Because configure await, or the the one that we obsolete could just return the input. It returns task or value task because it doesn't do anything.
I don't think we should do that. We should just have an analyzer if we want an analyzer.
Yep. Fair enough. But there is a slight difference in the amount of. How expensive are any of these awaitables compared to each other, Steve?
The cheapest one will be the one we currently have. The one that takes a await behavior. I haven't seen Eric's latest prototype, but I'm pretty sure it only allocates if the task hasn't completed yet, and if it has completed, it's 1 or 2 allocations, one of which is a timer, or a timer queue timer.
Mm-hmm. Right, so people who want the lean and mean and aren't wanting to use the current behaviors would still stay where they are, and once you want anything involving complicated cancellation, it's a slightly bigger struct and might allocate something.
Yeah, honestly, the size of the struct is probably, it might be the most impactful thing, because every state machine that uses one of these will grow by the size of that struct.
And is it by the size of the struct or by the size of the struct times the number of awaits?
By the size of the struct times the number of unique awaits on unique types. So if you have 17 awaits all on task, they're all going to share the same awaiter field. If you have an await on task of int, an await on task of double, and an await on task of string, you've got 3 awaiter fields.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, of all the things, dumping the struct and doing, removing suppress exceptions, removing force async, now getting rid of the struct and making some version of long configure await, and then some easy versions of you only wanted one of the 3 things. Seems like I think where we are, and seems fine to me.
I got to run, but I'm reasonably happy with something along those lines. Thanks.
So I just summarized it. It was we had configure await cancellation token, configure await timeout, configure await bool equals true, time span, or nullable time span equals null, cancellation token equals default. Is that what was proposed?
That's what I heard.
I wasn't sold on the default of the Boolean, but I'm willing to hold my nose and.
I actually prefer if we didn't default that Boolean, but I could hold my nose and swallow.
I mean, honestly, I don't feel super strongly. If both of you feel like that's uglier than forcing people to pass in a value because it's a sufficiently obscure thing and people that call this with multiple arguments likely know what the correct value is, that seems totally fine.
Yeah, and we can always default it later.
I'd honestly be fine if we didn't default any of them.
That's true. We gave you the simple ones. Once you want to do the complicated thing, once you want to do something slightly more complicated, pass null for your timeout. Explicitly.
I mean, that's fair. We can always default later, I suppose, right? I mean, I think it's probably, for the current proposed ones, it's probably fine if you have to pass all 3 because you only call this because you want to pass 2 anyway. You might as well just give a value for the 3rd. I mean, it would be interesting if we do the force async one, because this one we can't realistically add as a single value overload because bool is already taken. So if we would do something like that, then it becomes annoying if you want just this one advanced thing and then you have to pass in values for all of them. But maybe that's also okay.
Yeah, I think that the one interesting thing would be for force async, unless Steve can tell me why I'm completely wrong, is if we can make task.yield get configure await false behavior somehow attached to it, that then we would never need the force async because the answer would be await task.yield false.
it would actually probably be await task.yield. I misspoke earlier. Be await task.yield and then await foo. Because you're basically, at least as defined, this forced async would have ensured that the well, I don't know. It's complicated.
Anyway, we can come up with a force async scenario
there are a set of other proposals that are basically, I want to schedule a continuation to run somewhere. I want to schedule a continuation to run on the thread pool. I want to schedule a continuation to run on a specific task scheduler. Like if that's something we want to go and explore further, we can do that separately.
All right. So then, does anybody have feelings on the order between cancellation token and timeout?
I think we should go bool timeout cancellation token.
I agree.
Sure.
CTs go last.
Okay.
Eric, are you okay with all this? You put a lot of effort into this proposal.
Yeah, should be okay, I guess. My concerns about usability still stand though.
Meaning that we've made it too easy?
Yeah, exactly. I kind of predict the Stack Overflow posts proposing this as a universal cancellation mechanism.
Yeah, it's going to happen, and we're going to have to shoot it down. In .NET 7, we'll have the analyzer that says, are you sure you want to use this method?
I mean, we can add it, and we can go ahead and add the analyzer that's like, why are you doing this here?
We are going to need to make sure, given the overloads we're talking about, I don't think it will fire, but we are going to need to make sure that the analyzer that we've added that says you have a cancellation token, make sure you're passing it, we're going to need to make sure that it does not fire for this.
That would need to be updated, yeah. It does fire, actually, if you do...
Well, but we're not exposing bool comma cancellation token.
Yeah, you're probably right then.
But regardless, we need to double check because it would be terrible if it did fire.
Yeah, so it may be worth going ahead and trying to get in the same release as this one of, we added the thing because there are scenarios, but you're probably not the right scenario, so making it be a warning when we add it.
I don't know. I don't actually think we should have that analyzer right now, but...
Okay.
Yeah.
That was that's what I heard from your statement. I wasn't...
No, I was being more facetious than anything, but...
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Sarcasm doesn't come across well over video chat, especially when you're not on video.
So one question I have is, so I added this to all 4 versions, is that correct? So for both task of T result, value task, and value task of T result?
That's correct.
Yep.
And then the compiler service APIs remain unchanged, right? We still have all these read-only structs, and they look exactly as before, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And I will now do the devil's advocate, even though I literally don't care what the answer is. Async, enumerable, and dispose async?
No.
Okay.
If you... So, cancellation token, I don't want to muddy the waters. If you want to add a cancellation token and a timeout for the individual awaits in your loop or in your dispose, that's so niche. I think we should force you to write the code out. You should no longer use await for each. You should do get enumerator or get async enumerator and while move next async.
Okay, I'm totally fine with that.
Especially because for timeout, if you have a timeout, you probably are tracking elapsed time, and if you have multiple awaits, you probably want to change the timeout that's employed on every await to factor in how much time you've spent between them. It's rare that you say every await, even if I have 1,000 of them, gets a minute. You want it to be the first one gets a minute, the next one, I run for a second, so the next one is 1 minute minus 1 second, and so on. So I don't think we should do that. And cancellation token, I think it gets too confusing whether the cancellation token is being passed to the await or to the enumerator. Especially because we already have a with cancellation method on async enumerables.
Sounds good.
I can be convinced in the future, but I don't think we should do it proactively.
Yep.
All right, so then let me just copy paste what I have.
Yay for time box.
Indeed, the fact that we ran out of time 10 minutes ago is probably the only reason we finished.
Exactly. And enough people left the call that, it was more streamlined.
Well, yes, one person can always make a decision easily.
Unfortunately, that's not true either.
All right, so I posted it. Hopefully people are okay with what I wrote. Hopefully I didn't miss anything that was vital.
Eric, do you want to try and push this over the finish line, or do you want someone else to pick it up?
I have a pretty substantial backlog, I would say, for the month of March, and it also feels like a feature we probably would want to merge earlier rather than later in .NET 6.
All right, I can pick it up. It's fine.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so then I think that's it. Then I think next week we will do the JSON one, because we're sitting on the DOM APIs for a while now. Unless there's something else urgent, that's what we're going to do. All right, then I think that's it for today.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.